Ever since I started YouTube and got into self-discovery, I've become a bookworm. I went from reading 1 book a year to almost 40 books this year alone. And you know what? Reading is chill. I get why people have been doing it for thousands of years. It's like I'm downloading a piece of someone's brain. But I don't really care about reading thousands of books. I care a lot more about learning. Like, what's the point in reading 20 books on weight loss if you're gonna go slam McDonald's every night? I wanna make lasting changes to my life through reading. And those are the strategies I'm gonna share with you right now. So the first cluster of tips are related to the technical side of reading. These include physical actions of reading, like eyes to words to brain and all the logistical stuff. First tip is to read sitting upright, preferably in a chair or couch as opposed to lying flat in bed. Since most of us lay down to sleep, our body is conditioned to feel sleepy when we're horizontal. So when we read in this position, 2 things can happen and both are terrible. We either get drowsy, yawn, and then pass out after a couple pages, or we reprogram our brain think that laying down is actually reading time. And then it's harder to go to sleep because we've unconditioned ourselves for sleep. Plus, it's dangerous to hold books up like this. You wouldn't want to risk dropping it on your face and chipping a tooth. My recommendation: pick a dedicated spot that's well lit, upright, and reserve it specifically for reading. Tip 2 is to schedule in reading time. We suck at being consistent without structure. I myself know that if I don't physically pencil in time to read, I'm never gonna get around to doing it. There's always something else that feels more urgent, or there's some dopamine heavy binge that I'll fall victim to instead. So if you wanna form a habit of becoming a reader, the best thing you can do to show up is to put it in your calendar. I personally use an app called Cron, where I set up a recurring daily task to read for 20 minutes. This way I know there's an uninterrupted chunk of time devoted for reading every single day. And I usually end up reading for longer than 20 minutes anyways. But just start with 20 minutes. It doesn't sound like much, but if you do it daily, it adds up. Tip 3 is to read with your finger. Our eyes actually don't move smoothly without something to track. They jump around and do what we call saccade movements, which is why a lot of the times you read, you lose your spot and end up rereading the same line or sentence on accident. Actually, there's a really cool thing you can try right now with me to demonstrate what I mean. So look up from your screen for a second and don't focus your gaze on anything in particular, and try to move your eyes very smoothly from left to right. It's probably gonna be super difficult to do really slowly unless you use a lot of intentional focus. And even then, you'll realize that your eyes actually do these little jerky movements, and those are called saccades. All right, now let's reset and try it again, but this time, hold up your finger instead and follow it from left to right. Way easier, right? So pretty interesting how our eyes work, but the point is, using a tracking device makes it easier to read and not lose your spot, and it helps get you into that reading flow. Tip 4 is to read without speaking the words in your head. When we first learn to read and pronounce words, we're taught to say them aloud to make the association of words to our brain. But over time, reading becomes a muscle memory and instinctual. We can read and recognize words without actually having to say them aloud. For example, if I flash a few words on screen, you probably didn't have to read them, but you know exactly what they said, right? Reading every word in our head actually slows down our reading speed a lot. The visual data that our eyes get from seeing words is enough for our brain to recognize them and understand them without actually having to say them aloud. It's kind of a challenging skill to get the hang of because you have to break a habit and you've been taught to do it without even thinking, but stick with it because it can really speed up your reading once you get the hang of it. So moving on to the next cluster of tips, I call these emotional reading skills because reading is an emotional experience. A great analogy to demonstrate this section is to think of reading like dating. Books make us feel a certain type of way, the way the author crafts their stories. But we also feel a certain way towards books. We have preconceived notions about books. Or maybe you've just been eyeing this book for a long time, right? If I'm into someone, I'll clear my whole schedule and move mountains to see them and talk to them. And as a result, I'll learn about them much faster. The same goes for the opposite. If I'm not emotionally invested, I'll have no desire and learn way slower. So tip number 1 is to stop reading a book if you don't like it. Like, if I didn't enjoy going on a date with a girl, I wouldn't plan another date or chase after her just because someone else told me they thought she'd be the one. If the book blows and doesn't fit your vibe, then put a pin in it and go for another book. Not every book we try has to work out. Tip number 2 is to not read every single word in the book. This is really for nonfiction, but you don't have to read every single word to get the idea. I've realized that the majority of books are super repetitive and redundant. A chapter is usually like 1 to 2 ideas, followed by a ton of examples and explanations and stories about those ideas. So if I'm reading and I get the gist of it, I'm just gonna skip ahead to another idea. Like, this is the same way you'd get to know someone on a date. You ask them lots of different questions to get to know them. You don't need to spend the entire date asking about their career or their dog. You're both gonna get really bored. So when you're reading, don't be afraid to skip forward, skim, read it backwards, or whatever. Remember, we want to stay emotionally invested, not bored, in order to read more. Tip 3 is to follow your reading curiosity. I like to think that every year I grow and learn more. And along with that comes new ideas, new perspectives on life, and new curiosity for learning. So to read stuff that interests you now. Timing and headspace are really important factors. Depending on where you are in life, a book may be more meaningful. Like, if I read How to Win Friends and Influence People 5 years ago, I wouldn't have cared about anything I read. I probably wouldn't have gotten past the first chapter before I got bored. But it's because I've gotten so obsessed with self-discovery and self-development over the last few years that it's now so much more impactful for me. Which leads into tip number 4, where you should read multiple books at once. I'll repeat it again. Reading is an emotional experience. Similar to how people would go on multiple dates with many different people, you should be doing the same with books. Reading multiple books at once keeps it spicy, it adds variety, and it makes sure that there's always something desirable and interesting for you to read. If one book starts to get dry, then set it aside and add another one to the rotation. This also doesn't exclude the fact that a year from now, maybe you're growing out of your degenerate party animal phase and starting to deep dive into another phase of your life, then maybe that book will suddenly become way more attractive. Books speak to us at different stages in our life. And the best part is they're never going to be taken off the market, by GigaChat or something. All right, and the third group I call consolidation reading skills. These are the cluster of skills that make sure you aren't just stroking your ego by reading thousands of books, but that you're actually learning and remembering the information that you read. That's why we read books, right? We want to get ideas, satisfy our intellectual curiosity, get knowledge, or at the very least be entertained by what we read and implement them into our lives. Consolidation skills are all about immediately applying what you read at the first possible chance you get. When we're learning, reading, or experiencing something new, that information enters our short-term memory. This is called a memory trace, where a few brain cells, specifically in the hippocampus, get activated. If that information isn't used or applied in a meaningful way, then the memory trace will fade and we're gonna forget it. Our brain isn't very good at holding on to information if it's not processed and applied quickly. Like, think about the last time you went on a YouTube video binge to learn something. If you watched videos back to back to back, you probably felt like, hell yeah, I'm learning a whole bunch, this is great. But if you try to recall it tomorrow or next week, most of that information is gonna be forgotten. I mean, take this video for example. If you don't even try to take action to consolidate what I'm telling you right now, in a week, nothing will change and you'll still be reading like a snail. But we're built different at Cajun Koi Academy. What are you rookies gonna do instead? Stop and apply what you learn right there on the spot. Some people write directly in their books, some people highlight them, some people use post-it notes. I personally don't like scribbling notes or highlighting physical books. Like, I'm not gonna go back through this and look at my notes. I've been teaching how to learn for way too long to know that you don't learn jack shit from rereading and highlighting. That's why tip number 1 is to write about what you read in your own words. Mike and I write a weekly newsletter called Mood and Mind, which you can join, it's completely free, where we synthesize what we learn and read about to come up with new ideas. Now for me, I do almost all of my book reading on iPad using the Kindle app, synced to Readwise. What I like about these apps is how they export and sync highlights directly into my Notion database. I know I just trash talk highlights, but as someone who writes a lot, it's been a game changer for me. I'll highlight quotes that make me think or that I want to refer back to because I like to give credit where it's due. And I also have this organized database so I can easily cite authors and ideas while I create content, especially if I revisit or link an idea from a long time ago. Tip number 2 is to consolidate by having something to build alongside with what you're reading. If you're starting an online business and reading a book about business, then start building your business at the same time. If you're reading a book on social skills or dating, go out later and use what you learn to strike up conversations. Life is about upgrading our skill builds, and books are our skill manuals. We're constantly reading books and trying to apply them and building this business, building this brand, growing on social media, learning sales, all of these things. And even if you don't create content publicly like we do, although I definitely think you should, that itself is a super underrated skill. You can at least implement and engage with what you read in other ways. Talk about what you read with your friends or at the dinner table. Have discussions about what you read and why they're important to you. You can join a book club. Our amazing club leaders in Discord host regular book clubs to facilitate this process. you can definitely get started there. There are endless ways to consolidate what we read to improve our lives. We just have to be intentional and implement them as soon as possible to make sure they stay. So those are the 3 different skill build categories I see for really developing the ability to read more books that will actually make a difference in your life. Reading has become something very personal and important to my life, and I hope that with these skills, you'll fall in love and find a similar way to connect with it the way that I did. If you want to learn more skills, check out any other video in our skills lab, and I will see you all next time.